Warm wishes to one and all. Myself, Akila Ganesh, Professor and Head from the Department of Public Health Dentistry, Sri Ramachandra Institute of Higher Education and Research. I am here to present to you about feeding at sleep time, in short the FeAST scale, which is a tool for assessing the risk for developing early childhood caries. A brief introduction on early childhood caries. Early childhood caries, as we all know, is a significant public health problem globally. Harris et al. In 2004 had reported about 106 risk factors, while Kirtika et al. In 2019 had reported 123 risk factors, where an umbrella review by Lee et al. In 2021 has reported the most significant risk factors for early childhood caries. It is defined as the presence of one or more decayed, non-cavitated or cavitated lesions, missing or filled surfaces in any primary tooth of a child below 6 years of age, as given by Pitts et al. In 2019. The epidemiological triad for early childhood caries includes a susceptible tooth, cariogenic microorganisms, and fermentable carbohydrates. So, when studying these risk factors, we found that accumulation of milk or other liquids or food substances on the tooth surface throughout the sleep time can be a substantial causative factor in the occurrence of early childhood caries. Here, when I mean sleep time, I refer to both the nocturnal, which is the night time, as well as the daytime sleeping habits as well, which is a very common habit among the younger age group, that is the infants and the toddlers. So we felt that there is a need for an exclusive study for such sleep time feeding practices. In order to study such sleep time feeding practices, we need a separate scale which will focus primarily on such practices. With this Laconian research, we planned to develop and validate a scale to assess the sleep time feeding practices of infants and toddlers, to develop a scoring for the scale, which we call the feeding at sleep time scale, and to validate the scale using receiver operating characteristic analysis. So, methodology. Ethical approval was obtained from the Institutional Ethics Committee of the institution, and the study sites included 4 study sites, 2 of which were urban and rural health centers which were affiliated to the tertiary care center, and 2 were the private outpatient departments of the public and the private medical center within the tertiary care center. So the phases of development was followed as reported by Vaughan et al., which included formation of a conceptual framework, systematic development of an item pool, refinement of the item pool by focus group discussion, pre-testing, cognitive interviewing, and validity testing and reliability testing. So moving on to the results, a conceptual framework was formed based on a thorough literature search, existing knowledge as well as from expert knowledge and opinion. So the conceptual framework included 4 constructs, which was breastfeeding, bottle feeding, other feeding modes. This includes the use of the sipper, the tumbler, the palade, etc. And finally, the tooth and the diet construct. So the second step was the development of an item pool for each of the constructs which were formulated in the first step. So an initial item pool was formed, and the questions were usually written as full sentences. Double negatives, two-edged questions, slangs and abbreviations were avoided. And as recommended by Trackman et al. In 2017, certain amount of redundancy was followed at this stage, so that questions can be removed at a later stage if needed. Okay, and a conservative approach was followed, and to retain questionable items and not delete them at this stage. So the initial item pool consisted of 16 items in the breastfeeding construct, 18 items in the bottle feeding, 5 in the other feeding modes, and the tooth and diet construct having 6 items. Totally, the initial item pool consisted of 45 items. These items were then refined through a focus group discussion, cognitive interviewing, and a pre-testing. So the focus group discussion, This was facilitated by a moderator. In this, the participants were allowed to express themselves freely. Their opinions, their views were all allowed to express freely, and what the answer options were discussed and modified as suggested by the participants of the focus group discussion. So from 45 items which were formed in the initial item pool, the scale came down to 28 items after the focus group discussion. The focus group discussion was also audio and video recorded for later references. So the participants of the focus group discussion included mothers, pediatricians, pediatric dentists, and public health dentists. Next is the cognitive interviewing. The purpose of the cognitive interviewing was to test the scale for its adequacy, relevance, and understanding, to assess the comprehensiveness and clarity of the formulated items, and to generate new items or modify the existing ones. Information gleaned during the cognitive interviewing helped in elimination of irrelevant items as well as in rephrasing of items. So these are a few pictures of the cognitive interviewing carried out at the various study sites. Participants were allowed to do the think aloud protocol, by which the questions were read to the participants and they were allowed to think about the question, and their answer options was also asked. Later the options and the question, the understandability of the participant was elicited, and if the answer options were not a part of our items, they were modified as needed. Next is pre-testing. For pre-testing, we need to target the target population, which is usually infants. In our study, it is mothers of infants and toddlers. So they must be interviewed so that we can accurately capture their vernacular. This was as reported by Davis et al. In 1987. So face-to-face interviews was conducted with the mothers of infants and toddlers. And the primary aim of this pre-testing was to eliminate items that the participants felt as relatively unimportant. Pre-testing also helped to increase data accuracy, to identify any potential difficulties with the administration of the scale, and to check if jargon and technical terms were used with caution. So this table summarizes the refinement of the item pool. So initial focus group discussion on 14 participants. Next, a cognitive interviewing on 11 participants, and the average age of the child was 22.7 months, including 4 males and 7 females. Next, pre-testing on 20 participants with an average of 24.75 months and 8 males and 12 females. And the socioeconomic status, upper middle was 9, upper lower middle was 9, and the upper lower was 2. So next, the scale was subjected to validity testing. This was by a 5-member team subject experts, which included public health dentist, pediatric dentist, and pediatricians. So basically, face and content validity was assessed for the entire fee scale. The remarks were consolidated, discussed, and duly incorporated into the scale. One of the suggestions which was given by the experts was, for the question related to content of the bottle feed, formula milk and stored breast milk were not a part of our response options, but as per the suggestions from the experts, they were later included. Next, the scale was finally subjected to reliability testing by the test-retest method. So that it was subjected on testing on 57 mothers, of which 40 were retested after a span of 10 to 14 days. And that kappa value was 0.81 to 9%, which means an almost perfect agreement was obtained in 98% of the items. So basically, in the fee scale, there were 3 patterns of sleep time feeding practices which were assessed. One is feeding at the beginning of sleep. This means feeding through any mode while going to sleep. As a child is going to sleep, you are going to feed him and he is led to sleep as he is feeding. Next, feeding during early morning sleep. This means the practice of feeding early in the morning, okay, like around 4 a.m. or something, and then followed by a small nap for a few hours before active waking up. And the third is the feeding in between the sleep, which means feeding during the course of the sleep. As the child is sleeping for 6 to 8 hours or 10 hours during the night time, in between the child is fed with a bottle or with a breast or any form. Okay, so that is referring to the feeding during the course of sleep. This can even include a nap time sleep which lasted for 3-4 hours, and in between every hour if the child was fed through any means, that was also recorded in this feeding during the course of sleep. So this summarizes the schematic representation of the FeAST scale, the initial conceptual framework, the breastfeeding, bottle feeding, other modes, truth and diet construct, initial item pools, and the refinement during the focus group discussion, cognitive interviewing, pre-testing, and finally validity and reliability testing. So next, once a FeAST scale was developed, we realized that there is a need to score the scale, as well as we also plan to improve its validity by subjecting it to receiver operating characteristic analysis. So in this summarizes the various constructs. Under breastfeeding and bottle feeding construct, we have two sub-constructs, which is before introduction of solid foods and after introduction of solid foods. Okay, in both of the breast and the bottle feeding. Of this, for the scoring, only the after introduction of solid foods was considered, because usually the period before introduction of solid foods was a period when the child did not have any teeth, which is the initial 4 to 6 months of age. Similarly, other feeding modes were also not considered for scoring because there was a wide distribution in the consumption of these other feeding modes. Similarly, the truth and diet construct did not also facilitate in validity analysis and hence was excluded from the scoring. So for the scoring, these were the items which were considered. For the breastfeeding construct, duration of the habit, time of consumption, frequency during day and night, duration of each feed, and the 3 feeding patterns which I had told. Similarly, the same thing was considered for the bottle feeding construct, but 2 other items were also considered, which included the sweetener, what and when was included, and the use of additives other than the sweeteners like any health drink powder or something. Again, what was included and when was included. So this gave a total score of 21 for the breastfeeding construct and 40 for the bottle feeding construct. So we can see that, as I said, each of the items and what was the score given based on the response options. So the duration of habit, time of consumption, frequency during day, frequency during night. A higher score like 3 was given if it was 5 or more times. Next, again, for the other duration of each feed and the 3 feeding patterns. If they had, it was a score of 1 and did not practice, to a score of 0. Again, based on the content of the bottle. Okay, so score was given. This is not applicable for the breastfeeding construct. And again, based on the additives, again, only for the bottle feeding construct and not applicable for the breastfeeding. So arriving at a total score of 40 and 21 for the bottle and breastfeeding construct respectively. So these were subjected to analysis, and when the cutoff score was greater than 14 for the breastfeeding construct, the sensitivity was 80% and 1 minus specificity was 43%. So we had to select the score by which the sensitivity and specificity 1 minus specificity were optimal. Similarly, for the bottle feeding construct, it was a cutoff score greater than 11. So these are the area under the curve for the breastfeeding construct as well as the bottle feeding construct. We see that it is 0.7 for the breastfeeding construct and 0.788 for the bottle feeding construct, and with p-values of 0 implying statistical significance. So moving on to the discussion. The FeAST scale was developed and validated as a specific parent-reported measure. It is a new perspective because it evaluates all dimensions of parental feeding behaviors concerning sleep time among infants and toddlers. Develis has reported that the number of items included in the first draft must be 3 to 4 times as that would appear in the finalized version. So this was clearly followed through our development. So the initial item pool was developed with great care and no items were deleted at that stage. Next, moving on to the strengths of the FeAST scale, we included a varied socio-economic strata of the population. A panel of experts were involved. Variety of feeding constructs, all the possible feeding constructs of that age group was included. We did take into consideration any intake of solid food in between sleep, like a biscuit or a banana. The child was woken up during sleep and given, that was also considered. And pre-testing and cognitive interviewing, which are important vital steps during the development phase, were a part of the FeAST scale development. It was parent reported, easy to understand, with a simple scoring system requiring no technical assistant for recording it. And the sample size was also a large sample size, which was considered of about 527 for the calculation of the ROC analysis. However, the limitations are generalizability is uncertain because it is not a community based or a population based sample. It is a clinic based sample. Again, the problem of social disruptive bias on the side of the parent could have been a part of the recordings. To conclude, this was the first attempt to predict a child's risk for developing early childhood caries based on a score, exclusively assessing sleep time feeding practices. Plotted in the form of ROC curves, the AUC area under the curve reported good and significant correlation in the scores of children with ECC. And FeAST scale is a valid and reliable tool for predicting child's risk for developing ECC based on their sleep time feeding practices. However, I would recommend that the outcomes of the current scale are important and offer significant additions to the field of ECC. Though primarily developed as a research tool, additional uses as a potential clinical scale can be suggested. Further research is needed to confirm the prognostic value of using the FeAST score in other settings. Replication of this study across countries will further enhance the applicability and validity of the FeAST scale. So this is the scale which we had developed, the outer page, the inner write-up about the scale. These are the questions which were a part of the scale: breastfeeding, bottle feeding, other feeding modes, and the diet construct. And these are the publications which have come out of a paper. The initial development was published in a reputed community dentistry and oral epidemiology journal, and the ROC analysis was published in pediatric dentistry journal. So these are my references, and thank you.